Hello, and thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Kim Snyder. Before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am currently working on getting my certification in special education. I work as a paraprofessional in an autistic support classroom at the moment. I got my teaching degree from the University of Phoenix in 2012. Okay, so that's enough about me. Let's get started. I am going to share my screen with you so that you can see my PowerPoint as I talk you through it. All right, today we are going to discuss the acting out cycle. The acting out cycle was created by Jeff Colvin and Hill Walker from the University of Oregon. The acting out cycle shows us that behavior happens in a cycle. The explosive behaviors like screaming, throwing things, tearing up papers are actually at the end of the cycle. Many things lead up to these physical behaviors. As teachers, we need to learn to recognize the cycle of behavior from the beginning. Today, we will discuss the 7 phases of the acting out cycle. Understanding the phases will help you, as the teacher, to recognize the triggers that occur prior to the unwanted behavior. What we're about to look at here, this is the roller coaster graph. It represents the acting out cycle of behavior. The student starts their day at calm and will remain at calm until a trigger propels the cycle into motion. Once a trigger occurs, the student will become agitated. This phase has the potential to last a long time before moving into the acceleration phase. Without intervention and support, behaviors will continue to accelerate until peak behaviors are exhibited. These behaviors will begin to de-escalate with the help of teachers, and the student can begin the recovery phase, which is the final phase. Now, let us take a look at each of the 7 phases. Phase 1 is calm. In this phase, the student is cooperative, focused, and on task. This is how you would hope most students will come in during the beginning of the day. The goal is to keep students in the calm phase. You can encourage this by having a classroom management plan, by teaching and practicing the rules and expectations, by creating a safe and positive community environment where students feel comfortable to express themselves. It is always important to ensure that all the students' physical, emotional, and social needs are being met. Giving a student the right type of attention at the right time can avoid behavior problems. But when they cannot be avoided, the next thing to do is figure out what triggers those behaviors. And that brings us to phase number 2, triggers. Triggers is phase 2 of the acting out cycle. A trigger is whatever occurs prior to the behavior that causes the student to go from phase 1, which is calm, to phase 3, agitated. Some examples of triggers at school are a teacher asking a student to complete a specific task, transition times, a peer tapping her foot, the student believing that he is not capable of completing a task, boredom, or overstimulation. Some non-school related triggers which should also be taken into consideration, such as being hungry, tired, or stressed. This phase is very important because if you are able to recognize what triggers a student's behavior, then you can set up a pre-correctional plan to help the student learn new ways to handle their behavior. When a trigger occurs, or you can remove the trigger altogether. Providing support at this phase can interrupt the cycle and prevent the escalation to agitation. When triggers are ignored and support is not given, the student will move into the third phase of the acting out cycle. The third phase is agitation. In the agitation phase, students are off task and less focused. At this point, it will start to become harder to calm the student. This phase can last for a long time depending on how the teacher reacts. The teacher's goal is to interrupt the acting out cycle before it escalates to more challenging forms of behavior. During this phase, there are some strategies that may de-escalate the behavior. Talk with the student. See what's going on. Ask the questions. Give the student some options to choose from. This can be a difficult phase. If not addressed promptly and effectively, the student can begin to accelerate. The fourth phase of the acting out cycle is acceleration. This phase is usually when teachers start to pay attention to the behaviors. The student will become argumentative, refuse to work, or produce poor quality work. Teachers are more aware during this phase because the behaviors being presented will start to disrupt the lesson or the other students. In the acceleration phase, teachers need to do their best to redirect instead of engaging. At this point, you don't want to get stuck in a power struggle with the student or a never-ending argument. Use positive reinforcement for partial work completed. Give the student time to regroup. You want to give a prompt, then wait and give immediate positive feedback for any completion of the task. For instance, if you ask a student, it's time to get started, can you put your name on the paper and do the first 3 problems? As soon as that student starts to put his name on the paper, you can say, hey, John, thanks a lot. That was great work. If this phase continues, you will see the peak behavior. The 5th phase in the acting out cycle is peak behavior. This is the most unpredictable phase where you will encounter the most severe behaviors. At this point, the student is considered out of control and may be physically violent towards others or property. Students may exhibit behaviors such as crying uncontrollably, screaming, throwing, hitting, or biting. You want to avoid this phase if at all possible. If you find yourself in this situation, safety is of top priority. Teachers should have a plan in place for handling such a situation before it happens. The focus is on de-escalating the student. De-escalation is the 6th phase. This is when the peak behavior has begun to settle down and the student is moving back toward a calm state. Once the classroom and the student returns to a calm state, the final phase of recovery can occur. The 7th phase recovery includes introducing the student back into the classroom and talking with the student about the incident. The teacher should discuss with the student a plan to avoid reaching the acceleration phase of the acting out cycle. Now, why is this important? How can the acting out cycle help us as teachers in the classroom? First, if you understand the cycle that occurs with behaviors, you can learn to recognize the triggers for the behavior. If you know what triggers the behavior, you can intervene and interrupt the behavior cycle before it escalates. Second, Understanding what phase of the cycle your student is currently at will be the deciding factor on how you should handle the situation. Let's look at two scenarios. First, I will share an example of how recognizing the trigger can prevent the behavior. Second, I will compare two situations. One where the teacher is aware of the acting out cycle, and the other where the teacher has not heard of the acting out cycle. As teachers, if we recognize through data collection what triggers a student, we can then put supports in place to help students avoid agitation and acceleration. Let's take a look at Rosie. Rosie is in the 3rd grade. When she arrives in the morning, she gets off the bus in a very pleasant mood. She goes directly to the cafeteria where she eats breakfast. After breakfast, Rosie checks in at the special education classroom. We started to notice that Rosie was not pleasant during her check-ins, and she was starting to have some behavioral problems in her classroom. We observed Rosie in the cafeteria for a few days, and then had a conversation with Rosie about her experiences in the cafeteria. It turns out that there was too much stimulation in the cafeteria for Rosie. This was the trigger that led to her unpleasant mood and behaviors in the classroom. We decided to let Rosie eat breakfast in the special education classroom. Once we removed the trigger of the cafeteria, Rosie returned to her pleasant self and the behavior in the classroom stopped. Now we're going to discuss Stephen. Stephen has two teachers, Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Zerby. Mrs. Jones is an experienced teacher who understands the acting out cycle. Mrs. Zerby is a first-year teacher who has never heard of the acting out cycle. Let's see how the two teachers handle the same situation. Here's the situation. Stephen is banging his pencil on his desk while everyone else is working silently. Mrs. Zerby notices that Stephen is banging his pencil. She decides to use a surface behavior management strategy and ignores Stephen's pencil banging. A few minutes later, Stephen is yelling and ripping up his paper. He is at his peak behavior. The teacher tries to talk to Stephen, but he yells, "Leave me alone." Stephen continues to accelerate until the teacher has to have him removed from the room. At this point, the class has stopped working and everyone is staring at Stephen. This embarrasses Stephen and leads to more acceleration of the behavior. We see that by ignoring the behavior and then waiting till Stephen was exhibiting his peak behavior, Mrs. Zerby was unable to interrupt the cycle. She also was not able to respond appropriately without the knowledge of what phase Stephen was at. Let's look at the same scenario with Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones notices Stephen is banging his pencil on the desk. She knows if she approaches Stephen at this point while he is only mildly agitated and offers support, she will have a much better chance of helping the student solve the problem and return to a calm state. Mrs. Jones kneels down next to Stephen's desk and says, "Hey, Stephen, you seem to be having a hard time. Can I help you?" Stephen responds, "There are too many problems. I'll never finish them. I'm not doing any." Mrs. Jones says, "Okay, Stephen, I understand. What if you don't have to finish all the problems right now? How about we look through the problems and you can highlight 3 that you want to complete?" Mrs. Jones and Stephen highlight 3 problems, and Stephen starts his work. Mrs. Jones saw that Stephen was struggling. She talked to Stephen during the acting out cycle. She noticed Stephen was agitated and discovered that his trigger was that he felt overwhelmed by stepping in when she did and offering support. Mrs. Jones interrupted the acting out cycle and avoided the escalation to the peak behavior. You can see between the two scenarios, the second situation turned out much better, and Stephen and the class were able to continue working without distractions. In conclusion, the acting out cycle shows us that behavior does have a cycle, a starting point and a stopping point. There are 7 phases to that cycle. There's 7 phases of behavior. Recognizing triggers can help to prevent many behaviors. And knowing what phase a student is in can determine how to interact with the student. I appreciate you watching me today. I hope you learned something new. Thank you. Again, my name is Kim. Have a great day.